past year, we've all had to reimagine our lives, searching for new sources of inspiration and new ways to connect.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Hello.
I'm Yana Peel, Global Head of Arts and Culture at Chanel, and this is Chanel Connects. Bringing together creative game changers from film, art, dance, music, and fashion in conversation from their homes and studios.
I'm in the north of Scotland.
I'm in my spare room.
It's a very quiet area.
A horrific shade of yellow.
Still in New York City.
Some are old friends and collaborators. Others are meeting for the first time. All are focused on what matters most and what happens next. And now, we get to listen in. In this episode, Seeing the Unseen. Artist Arthur Jafa connects with painter and winner of the 2020 Rome Prize, Jennifer Packer. The conversation was led by Hans Ulrich Obrist, curator and artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London.
Could you tell where my head was at when you found me? Me and you went to hell and back just to find peace.
Thank you, AJ and Jennifer, so much. Because we are, of course, in lockdown in London, and I don't know about you, about New York and LA. If there is a lockdown, I wanted to ask you where you are.
I'm in my, studio, former studio, actually. I had a space in West Adams, which is kind of near the Underground Museum here in LA. But in the course of the last couple of weeks, I've sort of moved 3 or 4 doors down on the same block to a space that's a bit larger and cheaper. I guess that's a COVID thing. And cheaper. But they're doing some construction there now. So as a consequence, I'm sort of back here in the front of my sort of initial space. So here in LA in West Adams in sort of a previous, but I guess still extended studio.
Yeah, I'm in Harlem at home. Chilling. It's still early for me.
If it's early for you, it's very early for me.
Do you prefer Arthur or
AJ?
AJ? Okay.
You can call me Arthur if you want. There's a few people who hold out for Arthur, but pretty much that's AJ.
I always say AJ.
Yeah, most
I could hear an
AJ.
old black man saying Arthur.
Yeah, exactly.
If we can talk a little bit about this year, because it's been a very unexpected year in a sense, and I'm kind of wondering at the start of 2020 what you think you'll be doing right now and what you're actually doing right now.
You want to go first, Jennifer?
What I thought I'd be doing. I thought I would be having an espresso in Piazza del Popolo right now, you know. I'm supposed to be at the American Academy in Rome.
Oh.
So that's sort of been postponed. So I was like, all right, the Serpentine show would be up, the Mocha show would be up, and then I would just be in Rome thinking about what matters to me outside of commercial or public expectation. But I'm still in it.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, you're working on a new painting, right? Which is still in progress for the show in London.
No, that already went.
It went now. So can you tell us about that?
Oh, man. I've been thinking about like the different ways that you can like approach talking about work, and whether it's like social, political, or historical, or whatever. The list, I think, it goes on and on. But I like the idea of a painting as a monument, and I think that painting sort of sits in this place of like just thinking about sorrowfulness and mourning, and like if objects that we make or art that we make can house those things, if we can like expel them. I've been thinking a lot about Breonna Taylor and just like this overwhelming sense of impending doom for many Black folks that like no image can necessarily touch. And so just trying to like sort out my sense of disorientation in it all, like, and the contradictions that exist as someone thinking about painting, wanting to be in my pleasure in painting, and also like thinking about trauma and like trying not to turn away from it.
Thank you. And AJ, what about you? What are you doing right now? And at the start of 2020, what did you think you'd be doing right now?
I know one thing I started off at the end of the year saying, I'm going to travel 2/3 less. That was sort of my pronouncement to everybody. And I feel like since the Serpentine show, I've been like on a dead run for the last 4 years, essentially living out of my suitcase, which I think is pretty common, for artists. But then, having said all of that, I started off this year with this crazy dash. I was like Italy, to London, to Paris. It was like all in the course of 5 or 6 days. And I was just like, oh shit, this is definitely not what I had in mind. And then COVID hit. So, I had a couple of friends saying like I conjured the whole thing, So a lot of things that Jennifer was saying are, precisely the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about. Like, what are the terms of making art? And what are the goals and ambitions for that thing, Like, as Jennifer was saying, like the whole question of mourning, which I could just put under the rubric of the whole question of the blues, is a long-standing preoccupation for Black Americans. I'm not quite sure. I mean, Jennifer and I, we've never spoken before. I've just, been a big admirer of the work from the beginning. So I'm not sure whether this is true for Jennifer. Obviously, she'll be able to speak to it. But, I'm always very preoccupied with myself as a Black being. I don't even mean like so much as a Black artist, but as a Black being, and to what degree that frames or inflects how I approach what I do. Just on a purely kind of existential or emotional level, what is their relationship to that mourning? How do those things overlap and diverge?
Yeah. But I feel like trauma is the thing that we don't have control over. Like we're sort of, it's like being in a whirlwind and you're being carried away and you can't choose which way the wind blows. But I feel like the mourning is like sometimes conscious, like hopefully conscious, but sometimes like an unconscious processing that we can choose to have autonomy over to a certain extent. But the trauma is like, it's like the sweeping wave or something.
Jennifer, you said that your inclination to paint from life is a very political one, that you say we belong here, we deserve to be seen and acknowledged in real time, we deserve to be heard and to be imaged with shameless generosity and accuracy. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit why you are drawn to portraits and what actually makes an effective portrait.
I mean, the question, like, for me is, it's not like about the elevation of portraiture. Like that first question is about observation, right? Or that statement is about like bearing witness to something, which means that you first see something and that you acknowledge it and you take a position of truth, maybe, and you try to translate that. And sometimes people succeed or fail at that. I don't know about like the success of a portrait. Like I was thinking about what is or is not evidence. And painting is a kind of evidence of, if you see a massive painting like a Rubens, you're like, this painting is evidence of like the success of the transatlantic slave trade. It may also be evidence of people posing for that image, but for me, it's evidence of like amass riches, like within that trade or the scramble for Africa, like any number of approaches. I also move through, like, I feel like I graduate through works that I've liked or disliked from like one side or the other. Like I approach a work that I dislike 1 year and 3 years later, really I can appreciate, or 10 years later, really appreciate. I don't know, success is very complicated like that. And the sort of like inability to anticipate entirely like how your needs will change is something that I think about all the time in the studio. I mean, I think a lot about people seeing the work, and like, I was thinking about how people talk about the work as beautiful, and how sorrowful I've felt making like so much of it, like that sort of like that wound will never be healed. And in spite of that, like I try to produce something that feels authentic, that is authentic to me, and that can be generative and generous. I don't know. It's complicated. I think that somebody asked me like, what's an artist's job? It's like, you need to be looking regardless of the benefits that you reap from that looking. Like, I think about, what's his name? Ramsey Ortega. It's like, who filmed Eric Garner. It's like, I was like following over the past 3 years. Like, it's like, you did a great service and you have been punished for it. You are punished for bearing witness.
Mm-hmm. When you approach the beginning of creating one of these things that we term a painting, like it's not an empty space that you're entering into as a woman, as a Black person, you know what I mean? It's not like an arena that's just a neutral arena. And the complexity of what it means to be in a space that in some ways, in many ways, structurally speaking, you're not supposed to be in on one hand, but at the same time, you still have to contend with all the shit that anybody else who takes a brush and dips it in some pigment and puts it on the canvas has to contend with is the incredible weight of everything that's been done. I'm wondering how that plays into, you know, how you approach your work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I often say in a really like cheeky way that I think some of the white and white identified folks I know who had been making paintings for a long time got tired of their own history and abandoned painting. And they didn't spend enough time like parsing through issues, you know, around the language of mastery, which I wanted to talk about all the time. And it drove people crazy because people can't distinguish between like mastery and privilege or mastery and whiteness, mastery and power, as opposed to like mastery as like a subjective location from which an individual can make work, like that charged arena. And so I always wanted to talk about that. I mean, I'm not paralyzed by the history of things that weren't left for me. I'm like, I could take it or leave it. Like, I'm like, remix, like, you know what I mean? Totally. I'm moved by it. And I talk about Caravaggio or something. Like, I don't think he would be super happy to meet me, you know, or like, I don't, you know what I mean? But like, he left some really great works for, you know, someone who, when I was living in Rome, I was debilitated by depression. And I was like, he's crazy too. This is great. But if this was like the 16th century or something, he wouldn't have let me in the studio.
Right.
And I never would have like had that connection. There are like ways in which we can connect with people whose works sometimes overlap with our interests. Like all, the conversation, you know, like when you talked about Blackness and suffering and sorrow and misery, it's like there's so much there that I cannot turn away from. And I always felt was in the work. And because of that, I didn't feel like I had to explain anything. And so if people misread stuff, if they thought it was cute or stupid or silly or superficial or Sunday painting, I just leaned into it. I was like, that's fine. That's fine. Because, you know, it doesn't bother me any. Like, the trauma is there. It's next week, last week, the week before, a month from now. Like, all of those things are, to me, embedded in the work. And it's not my job to, like, point out the nuances for everyone to access.
The first time that I took note of Jennifer's work, I remember just, you know, like seeing it and not knowing anything about who did it or anything. I was just like, even the whole impulse to figure out who had done it was part of, like, to me, you know what I mean? The metric of it succeeding. Like, I was like, oh, who the fuck did this, you know? And it's the painting that I think is, I always thought it was a policeman or something. I couldn't quite tell. You know the one I'm talking about?
This one?
Yeah, that's the one. That is the one. That when I saw that thing, I was like, whoa, what is this? Is that a policeman?
I mean, I think it's like it's like a question in the painting itself. Like, I made two versions of that painting.
Okay.
One in which like that person mimicked an officer. I was like thinking about the distinction between an officer and a security guard.
Oh, yeah.
At a certain point.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
like the arming and the sort of like questions of power. But people usually just refer to it as a painting of a police officer. And I do not I never correct them. I never correct them. I mean, I think that painting, like an exercise in tenderness, the blue painting, was one where people started to rethink what the rest of the work might be. It really contextualized the practice so intensely that it's almost like, and then say her name. It's like people couldn't, I can't remember a time when people were really talking about Blackness in relationship to my work necessarily in a way that was like tethered to loss or sorrow. And I think mostly like people quote me when they talk about my work too, like things that I've said about those subjects. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in like how we process a feeling of alienation, and we can interrogate that nonetheless. I'm interested in like making works that feel less successful, I'll say, but are ever so important to the works that came before and the works that'll come after.
You know, it's funny. I think maybe it's an age thing. It's a fatigue thing. It's like there are times, and there have been times in my life where I didn't want to talk about the stuff at all. I was just like tired of talking about it, or not even like kind of tired of thinking about it. And in addition to that, tired from what? Like part of what I think everybody can understand is nobody wants to be boxed in. Nobody wants the terms in which their work is apprehended or appreciated or not liked to be so narrow and be so, overdetermined in a way. I mean, I think everybody is looking for a non-contaminated reading of what they do. But I guess I came to a certain conclusion at some point where I felt like these arguments about whether I'm an artist or a Black artist, all those kinds of arguments, they were determining aspects of the context in which we find ourselves. It's like no escaping that. And the conversation about it is a thing unto itself, like that has a relationship to what you make, but it's a thing unto itself that you could be interested in talking about or not interested in talking about, or interested in talking about at a certain moment and not at other moment. Like I'm for all my yapping, because I'm constantly yapping about these things, I don't do a whole lot of talking about my actual work. Like if you stood me in front of any of my works and said, well, what is this about? I immediately will freeze up because I don't feel like I know what they're about, particularly when they're functioning at what I would term their best. I don't know what they're about. I mean, the reason that I feel like they're working when they're really working is because they absolutely supersede my ability to reduce them to language. You know what I mean? They supersede my ability to say what it's about.
Bearing witness has a cost, and I think it could seem sort of arbitrary in the scheme of painting. I think in AJ's work, it's like clearer to me. Like when I see that Walter Scott scene, I'm like, that person is hiding behind a tree. Like they're tucked away. You know what I mean? It's an insane compositional element that very few painters would incorporate into a work because it's symmetrical, like it's overly balanced. There's like this weird horizontal that turns it into a cross. And I've been thinking about how to incorporate that to a painting for like the last 2 years without being overt about it.
I remember the first time, this was when Love is a Message was up at Gavin's. The first time I did like a full-on public talk in the face of it, and I had this laser pointer that Hans had given me. So I ended up kind of spontaneously going through Love is the Message shot by shot in front of the audience. I mean, it's short enough that you can kind of make it through it. And I know like a lot of people were troubled when I talked about the whole Walter Scott thing and what was beautiful about it. You know what I mean? Like compositionally, what was strange and ineffable about it. At the same time that it was such a, horrible image of a Black person being murdered, But you're right. Like I've had many conversations with people in the sort of aftermath of the George Floyd murder, like asked me about my relationship to showing Black death or, or Black suffering or something like this. I think suffering and death are two different things, but I mean, suffering is something you experience. Death is something to a certain degree societally we experience. We experience other people dying, other people being gone. But when you suffer, that's the person. I mean, you can experience people suffering as well, but I think it's more located in the subject position of the person the thing is happening to. But like for me, I think I've tried to speak to the fact that there's never one way of understanding or looking at a thing. And one of my metrics of a thing that I think that succeeds or a thing that I like or I'm attracted to or I think favorably of is a thing that does more than one thing. It's got to do multiple things in a complicated and coherent. And my sense of beauty is not tied to quote unquote what the thing looks like, but it's tied to what the thing is doing what it's doing in relationship to some givens about the world that we may share or not share. As Jennifer was saying, the whole bearing of witness is a big part of it. But the question then becomes, how do you inscribe what you witness in a thing? And how effectively do you do that? And to what ends do you do that? I'm always seeking, I think it's a kind of conceptual equilibrium. It's like, okay, you're addressing the beauty of the thing, so I want to address these other aspects of the things, because the beauty of the thing is getting attended to on a certain level. So like, I will get into things that I think sometimes they go into a kind of what a lot of people would consider a space of decadence, maybe a space of like, a kind of perversion, let's say. For example, if I start talking about the aesthetic values of a shot of Walter Scott being murdered, you know what I mean? People would think like, wow, that's really, really problematic. But there's something to be said for what I might term like the joys of being a gravedigger. Like we always think of gravediggers as a person who did that job because nobody else wanted to do that job. You know what I mean? Like who would choose to be a gravedigger? But there's some people for whom that's a calling.
Yeah, I mean, I started reading this book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, by Kevin Kawashi.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but just him talking about the difference between quiet and silence. That like silence is the opportunity to express yourself, but like refusing to do so or withholding. I'm very interested in the distinction between that and. This is the way that I thought about it, that it's like you're sort of processing a state without direct external stimuli, which maybe goes back to the idea of like trauma and mourning. Like I've been thinking a lot about what it means to recover publicly and privately, like as an individual and within a practice. Like that first question Hans Ulrich asks is like, what did I hope to be doing? It's like recovering, like. And so I'm like trying to think about like, of course, the cost of bearing witness, the silence, the quietude, and the recovery is everything.
But it's interesting that we're talking here in a recorded conversation about silence, because I always remember I went to interview the philosopher Gadamer. He was almost 100 years old, and I visited him in Germany. He was alone in a big house, and we started a conversation. I put the camera on the table, we started to film, I had an audio recorder as well. And all of a sudden he fell asleep. It was very strange because I just couldn't wake him up. And I also, of course, didn't want to really wake him up because he needed to rest. But then luckily the telephone rang. It was the time of landlines, it was around 99. So he picked up the landline, super loud landline, and said, Gadamer, I cannot talk to you, I'm in an interview. And he hung down, the landline, the phone, and he looked at me and he looked at the camera and he said, you will have a greatest difficulty to transcribe my silence.
That just brings to mind, like, it brought to mind the last time I saw Audre Lorde, because I was very fortunate to work on the documentary sort of profile of Audre Lorde that Michelle Parkinson and Ada Gay Griffin directed. But the last image I remember of her is we were in St. Croix. We had been shooting her for a few months. And we were shooting her when she would have her doctor's visits in New York, with her oncologist. But we were down in St. Croix where she lived with her partner. And she had a big sort of easy chair that they had outside. They had set it out in the yard and it had blankets on it. And, it was her comfort chair. And we've been shooting her for maybe like 4 or 5 days, and we were scheduled to shoot her back in New York, I think the following week when she was going to visit her oncologist again. And I went to say goodbye to her. And when I got there, she was asleep. And of course, I was like, I remember just staring at her. But, of course, I wasn't going to wake Audre Lorde up, period. And I was like, I'll see her next week. There's no problem. And of course, she died, a few days after that. And it's like, for me, it's something about as powerful a kind of presence as she was and as articulate as she was. And she also had that same quality. She would doze off and we would say action and it would be like, boom, like she had never been asleep, But just to see her in that state of just, she was calm. She seemed very calm to me.
I wanted to ask you both, it's a question about the unrealized projects, because we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they always publish them, but we know very little about artists' unrealized projects. And there's of course many reasons why a project is unrealized. It can be too big to be realized, too small to be realized, can also eventually be forgotten in a locker. It can be a project which is censored in terms of censorship. It can also be a project we simply haven't dared to do. So there are many reasons why a project should be unrealized. And I wanted to ask you towards the end of this conversation to tell us about one of your so far unrealized projects.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get rich. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
No, you're not.
Yeah, you're right. No, but I've been wanting to start this artist residency for like BIPOC with an emphasis on the B, artists that's like interdisciplinary, intergenerational, which I've wanted to do autonomously, which requires finances that also like require me to part with more of the work. I have a very fraught relationship with parting with works. Like, you know what I mean? I'm surrounded by a handful of things, and I know that the vision would be realized more quickly if I just chilled on that. But part of the structure of the residency would be such that we could imagine a world in which everything that we make does not have to leave us. That like there's cultural capital like in the labor and in the products and in the conversations, and we could house them somewhere. So I think that's the primary one. Yes, like, I mean, I've also like wanted to do a lot of writing, which I can't seem to fit into my schedule at all, but I'm thinking a lot about young Black contemporary artists, thinking about legacy, and like I was watching the conversation between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni this morning, and just seeing this like distinction between like their approaches generationally, but also like as like gendered Black people. And I'm interested in building like a library of conversations. I'm really interested in oral history, so I'm doing a project with like an organization in Sarasota, Florida, that's centered around like Black life and the Black community there. But I mean, I think those are the primary motivators outside of like the practice as it sits right now.
AJ, can you tell us about your so far unrealized project?
I think for me, because of my particular kind of trajectory, I've been sort of, in a sense, remining or excavating whole bodies of idea, things that I sort of thought about, but when I didn't have for whatever reason, I wasn't able to produce work. I guess what I'm trying to do, and I don't know if this is a specific work, but I'm trying to describe things which maybe more than a handful of people, Black folks, would agree, yeah, that's true, that's kind of true, and then try to figure out what the implication of that is in terms of particular work. Like, for example, because ontologically speaking, Black people like came into being like on slave ships, let's say. There's a way you can understand that, on slave ships, that we would chain together. Like, even though that was a horrifying experience, on one hand, one of the side effects of it is a kind of non-hierarchical relation. You know, it flattened things. It flattened certain kinds of things, because if you find yourself, as, you know, Fredo Sadia might say, in the hold, you know what I mean? Whether you were African prince or queen or whatever you are, an outlaw, a criminal, an anarchist, it wouldn't matter. Everybody got leveled. And that leveling is, on one hand, one of the most, you know, dehumanizing aspects of the experience. But, you know, it's like the upside of underdevelopment. It's like the flip side of that is it has given us a very particular kind of relationship to proximity and relationship and intimacy and differentiation in the space of, you know, a crab, a barrel, you know, that you've been forced into. Like, it's given us some very particular relationships to those things that are, I think, atypical of human beings and human communities in general. So for me, it's like, how do I take something as simple or as straightforward as that insight, we have a very particular relationship to hierarchy because we were chained in the bottom of boats together. How do you do something with that? So my unrealized project, a yet to be realized project, is bound up with like what to make of those kinds of observations or hypotheses.
Thank you so much. And actually, my unrealized project is to do a big exhibition of all the 4,000 unrealized projects I've archived asking this question since Alighiero Boetti, in 1989 gave me that task. And the irony is that whenever we get close to realize this exhibition, it somehow falls through. So the exhibition of unrealized project remains an unrealized kind of project. Knowing that many young artists are listening to our podcast, what would be your advice to a young artist?
My answer is always the same thing. Really pursue your bliss. Like at the end of the day, you have to identify your bliss. You have to pursue it. You can't let anybody deter you from it. There's no guarantee of success or failure, but success or failure, that's kind of illusionary anyway. But you got to figure out what it is you were put here to do that nobody else can do because nobody else is really quite interested in doing it the way that you want to do. And just to try to increasingly practice not seeing things in terms of good or bad. It's, like I say often, it's like, I'm trying to make work like, Mount Fuji. It's just outside of the scope of being a good mountain or a bad mountain. It kind of just is. It's like, so that's what I would say. Really pursue your bliss, pursue like what's singular in terms of your preoccupations.
Yeah, no doubt. I think understanding the distinction between works that artists feel for and the commodities that collectors and curators respond to are different. I think the idea of like following your bliss is like super complex, and I want to like posit some criticality around that. It's like everyone doesn't have the same commitment to your trajectory or your work. And I think it's hard when you're in the whirlwind to describe what it is you're aiming for, like privately in the work and publicly. And I think people should be honest with themselves about like what they're yearning for and how those sort of distinct and usually like divergent impulses affect the practice overall. I think Adrian Piper speaks really well in the book that was modeled after the Rilke Letters to a Young Poet, which is Letters to a Young Artist. She sort of talks about the distinct approaches to success, like within the quote art world versus within one's independent, private, meditative studio practice.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. This was so amazing. I'm so grateful.
We have to talk again, Jennifer, okay?
For sure.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Chanel Connects. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app to get new episodes as soon as they're released.